Szanowni Państwo, aż trudno uwierzyć, ale przed nami ostatnie spotkanie dzisiejszego dnia. Spotkanie, na które my czekaliśmy z niecierpliwością i myślę wielu z Państwa również. Przed nami spotkanie dzięki potędze światłowodu z Yuvalem Noah Hararim i Fransem de Waalem. Yuval Noah Harari, historyk i autor bestsellerów, profesor na Wydziale Historii Uniwersytetu w Jerozolimie, uważany jest obecnie za jednego z najważniejszych, najbardziej wpływowych intelektualistów na świecie. Jego popularne książki Sapiens, od zwierząt do bogów, Homo Deus, krótka historia jutra i 21 lekcji na XXI wiek sprzedały się w wielu milionach egzemplarzy na całym świecie. Frans de Waal, holendersko-amerykański etolog i biolog, znany z pracy nad zachowaniem i inteligencją społeczną naczelnych. Książki jego autorstwa, również tłumaczone na wiele języków na całym świecie, uczyniły go jednym z najważniejszych, najbardziej znanych prymatologów na świecie. Rozmowę z naszymi gośćmi poprowadzi Bartosz Węglarczyk, dziennikarz, redaktor naczelny Onet.pl. Zanim przejdziemy do rozmowy, jeszcze jedna techniczna uwaga dla Państwa, którzy stoją przy wyjściu. Chciałabym zaproponować miejsca po drugiej stronie sali. Tam są jeszcze krzesła, można zasiąść spokojnie i wysłuchać rozmowy z naszymi gośćmi. Yuval Noah Harari, Frans de Waal i Bartosz Węglarczyk. Przywitajmy serdecznie.
On behalf of the Freedom Games, welcome to this amazing event, and thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Frans de Waal and Mr. Yuval Harari are with us. Thank you so much for finding time to talk to us. There are many topics that I would like to go over, so let me start with an easy and simple question first. Are we humans, as humans, unique on Earth? Or are we just a part of a bigger system, or are we something very distinct from the system that is around us? Mr. de Waal, please.
Well, we are primates. I'm a primatologist, and so I look at humans as one of the 200 primate species, and it's a special species if you want to, but certainly a species that has language, which I think is very special, and walks on two legs, which is somewhat special. You know, penguins walk on two legs too, so there's a bunch of other species that walk on two legs. But other than that, we are animals among animals, in my view, and so we have a long tradition in the West, especially, of setting ourselves apart and saying that we're closer to the angels than to the beasts. And many of us have believed that because it was repeated so often by both religion and philosophy. But I think it's a wrong view of the human species.
Mr. Harari?
Well, I think that on one level, yes, we are just animals, not particularly different from other apes and other animals. On another level, of course, we are unique. We have unique abilities to cooperate in large numbers, which makes us more powerful than any other species on Earth. And this ability, in turn, is rooted in the capacity to use language and to create imaginary realities. We know more truth than any other animal, but we also believe more nonsense than any other animal. And this is part of our power. If you look at any large-scale human corporation, at the basis, you will find mythologies and fictional stories, not just about gods, but also about nations, also about money. As far as I know, we are the only animal that uses money, which is a fictional creation. Mm-hmm. And the other, I think, distinct thing about us, when I look to the future, is I think we are on the verge of really changing the basic rules of the game of life, which makes us really unique. For 4 billion years, life on Earth was governed by the evolution of organic beings, and we are the product of this organic evolution, like the chimps and like the jellyfish and like viruses. But we are on the verge of starting a potentially new process, breaking out of the limited organic realm and starting to create the first inorganic beings in the history of life, and also transcending, in a way, evolution by natural selection and starting a process of creating life by intelligent design. Not the intelligent design of some god, but our intelligent design. So this makes us really unique compared to all the other animals.
Yeah, it could go well. You're an optimist, maybe. This could go well, but...
I'm not saying it will go well. I mean, it's just something we do. It could go terribly wrong, of course.
Yeah, the times that we have messed with nature, like invasive species introduced in Australia, things like that, it has not gone so well. So yes, we have the capacity. I think we have the capacity to create actually new human beings, which is ethically a frightening prospect, actually. We have that capacity, and it's going to come. And you're right. That could change the whole game, and I hope it goes well.
What's the new human being? When you say new human being, what are you talking about? What is the new human
Well, you could change the DNA. You could create new kinds of human beings, and I don't know what people would want. Would they want more intelligence? Would they want nicer people? I don't know what the desires are in this regard, but we have that capacity. That's coming. Yeah.
We already today we have the technical ability to start redesigning humanity. Yeah. Luckily, we still have ethical and political breaks to slow it down or to prevent it. But the technical ability is already there. Yeah. And genetics and genetic engineering is just one avenue of doing that. We also have this remarkable improvement in computer science and artificial intelligence. So genetics is really just, in a way, taking natural selection, evolution, and pressing the fast forward button. Something that would have taken 1 million years of evolution, we'll try to do it in 10 years. But then we have completely new ways to create and redesign entities, the inorganic way of linking humans to computers, brains to computers, or even creating completely non-organic entities. Yeah. Artificial intelligence, perhaps even artificial consciousness, which is even a more radical change. You can say that genetic engineering is just playing with the same bits and pieces that evolution has played for billions of years. This is something completely new, to create really inorganic entities.
Yeah, so I'm just reading this book, The Code Breakers, about the CRISPR technology. And when in China, there was a Chinese scientist who applied that actually to human fetuses. And so he created some new humans with new DNA in them. And it became a big scandal. And I think he's now in jail. But still, this is going to come. We're trying to slow it down, the process, and to have philosophers involved about the moral implications, but it's going to come. And I think it's a very difficult decision. Do you want smarter people, for example? And if we create them, what are we going to do with them? Are they going to be in charge? Or, it becomes a really difficult decision, I think.
As a historian, I think it's really almost inevitable, because humans have always dreamt about perfecting themselves. Yeah. Like every religion and every ideology in history, whether it's Christianity, communism, they dreamt about perfecting humanity. But they always had this problem that they didn't understand really how humans work, and they couldn't overcome biology. So they always postponed the dream of perfection to some other place and time. So the Christians, realizing that they won't be able to perfect human beings on earth, they said, okay, the perfection will come in another world, in the afterlife. After you die, you become perfect. And the communists after gaining power and failing to create the new perfect society and the new perfect man, they said, oh, well, it will take more time. Not now, but in 50 years, 100 years, then it will happen. So the dream was always there. And biology was always the biggest obstacle. That people had these fantasies, and biology was in the way. And now if you give the tools to start changing or overcoming biology, just, think about sex life. Almost every religion and every ideology wanted to really change human sexuality or limit it, but they couldn't. You had vows of chastity in the church, and how many people actually lived up to the vows of chastity? Now think, if you can really start messing with human biology, what will be the result of these sexual fantasies of different religions and ideologies?
Yeah, but you have to be careful with biology because, as I said, this can also go wrong. I think we have this idea that we have to overcome biology. There's this old tradition of dualism where the human mind is in charge and controls the body, so to speak. And we've always wanted to control the body. And this has been mostly a masculine endeavor. It's the male mind that is superior, and the male mind is superior. The white male mind is superior, and all the rest of creation, including animals and women and other racial groups, they were inferior. And so the human male mind was seen as the pinnacle of evolution. And the body, the flesh is weak. That's how we would put it. Is the body was considered something cumbersome that maybe we want to get rid of it one day. And there are actually people who want to freeze their brains after death and hope that they can implant them in some machine later on, their brain contents. I think all this running away from biology, which we have been doing for a couple of thousand years, is potentially very dangerous, because I think biology will always come to bite back. And actually with the current pandemic, that's what we're seeing. Biology is coming back, nature is coming back and biting us back, because we have tried to control the whole world and overfish the oceans and overheat the planet and eating bats and whatever. We have mistreated nature, and nature is coming to bite us back at the moment. And I think this kind of interventions where we want to overcome biology have an enormous grave danger, I think. So we have to be careful. It's a complex system. That's what it is. It's not a simple system. It's a very complex system with many moving parts. And you take this part out or you remove it, you may be disturbing something terribly.
Is there any human behavior that you would call that this behavior goes against the nature, it's unnatural? There are many people who say that humans are unique in a sense that, for example, we are the only species that kill for pleasure. And no other species kills for pleasure. Is killing for pleasure unnatural?
Have you ever seen a fox in a hen house? I'm not sure that animals don't kill for pleasure. So I don't think that's typically what they do, that's for sure. Yeah, and that's, of course, killing between species. That's a predator and a prey. What is special about humans is maybe genocide. There are animals who kill sometimes on massive scales, like ants. If you read on ant wars, you get this impression that they may kill millions of their own species. But I think human genocide is something special. I'm not sure I have equivalents of that in other species. It's a problem with humans is we do all the things that other animals do, but we do them better and more systematic. And that also applies to the bad things that we do. It applies to the good things, but also to the bad things.
I would say that we do many special things. We can list a few, but again, none of them is against unnatural or against the nature, because this is simply impossible. I mean, the whole idea of against nature came from theology, that there was this theological idea that God when he created animals and humans, he gave them certain purposes, and it's natural to act towards these purposes. And if you act any other way against the purposes God gave you, this is unnatural. Now, this was an idea from theology, not from biology, not from science. From a scientific perspective, nothing has a purpose. The laws of nature or nature doesn't set purposes to things, like with the feathers. It's not that feathers were given to birds for the purpose of keeping themselves warm, and if you now use it to fly, you're doing something unnatural. No, I mean, in evolution, things begin with a certain usage, and they acquire other usages. Like fingers evolved initially so I can climb trees and pick fruits. But if I now play the piano, or if I now hit the keyboard in my computer, that's natural, that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, of course.
So
we've had this discussion also when we came to altruism. You know, at some point we had these theories that genuine altruism doesn't exist, neither in humans nor in other animals. And so then when people came up with examples of altruistic acts that are not repaid and that give no benefits to the one who performs them, people would, for example, Dawkins would say these are misfiring genes. And what he means, it's basically an unnatural act. He was using that kind of terminology because in his theory, it didn't fit. And so they called it unnatural behavior. And a lot of altruism in nature is performed under circumstances where it gives no benefits. And I think it's perfectly natural. It's just an outgrowth of that general tendency. So, for example, I've done a lot of research on empathy. How do animals react to the emotional states of others? And empathy for the longest time was not considered a natural tendency. Empathy was restricted to humans, according to most psychologists, and it was a typically human tendency. And now we have this idea that empathy, actually being sensitive to the emotions of others, is something we find in many species. And it can be applied within the species, which is the normal circumstances for it, like you apply it to your offspring or to your friends. But it can also be applied sometimes between species. And so humans do that, of course. We empathize sometimes with a stranded whale, for example, which is certainly not why empathy evolved. But animals can also sometimes empathize with other species, such as, for example, when dolphins save human swimmers, that kind of things happen. So empathy evolved for this particular purpose, and then it can be expanded. And I think with sexuality, we have the same thing. It evolved initially, and your feather example is the same thing. It evolved initially for this, and then it expands to other possibilities. And this happens all the time with all sorts of capacities.
And some of these things humans take some of these things to places which are really unique to them. So if you think about money, this, as far as I know, is unique to human beings, and it's linked to the capacity to create imaginary realities that we all agree on, to basically tell fictional stories and believe them. And money is not an objective entity. It has no objective value. It's not like a banana that can really feed you. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, you can't do anything with it. But as long as we all agree, you have these storytellers come, the big bankers, the best storytellers in the world, and they come with this fantastic fictional story that this little piece of paper is worth 10 bananas. And if we all agree on that, it serves as the basis for a global trade network. I can go to a supermarket, give this piece of paper to somebody I never met before, and he gives me a banana I can eat. Now, as far as I know, humans are able, at least with some animals like capuchin monkeys or chimpanzees, they can teach them how to use tokens.
Yeah, there are studies by Robert Yerkes. It started like almost 100 years ago. He started doing studies with a machine that I think they call it the monkey automaton or something. They taught chimpanzees to to have coins and put them in there, and they could get goods for it. And so you can teach them to use money, and they even understand that they can exchange less valuable items for more like that would be like a $10 bill for a $100 bill, and they would prefer the $100 bill. and we've done all these exchange experiments with capuchin monkeys too, and so they can understand. I wouldn't say the concept of money, but they can understand the exchange concept and the value of certain valueless items that have a potential to give you rewards. But I don't think any animal uses this capacity in nature. So humans have elevated this to an enormous level, of course. And yes, there's an enormous amount of manipulation going on with money and so on. But the very basic principles can be taught to other species. Yeah.
I'm all for statement that money is unnatural. If we can agree that money is unnatural.
No, it's again, it comes from a natural capacity that we have to tell stories and to create kind of fictional realities that we all agree on. If you can, we are now in the midst of the Olympics. So think about this amazing thing that people from all over the world come to this one place and compete in all kinds of games. Now, to compete we tend to think about the Olympics as a clash between different nations, like everybody is cheering for their own national team. But underneath it, there is first of all agreement, consensus, that everybody needs to agree on the same rules for the swimming competition. Otherwise, you can't compete. And these rules are, most of the time, they're our own fictional creations. And I mean, nobody would argue that the laws of football came down from heaven in a fixed form or are encoded in our DNA. We invented these rules. And the amazing thing is we can reach a global consensus how to play football. And this is not something unnatural, but it is something that, it exists to some degree among other animals, but we have taken it to an extreme, which is the basis for everything from religion to trade to sports.
Yeah, that's very human-like, because of course, my primates, they play all the time, and also measuring your strengths against others, all of that, they do that all the time. But I don't see much of a rule, general rules in there. The only rule is that you don't hurt your partner. And if you do, the partner will certainly protest and get back at you. So that kind of rules, but playing sports like we do, and the offside rule in football, for example, which is very complex, in my opinion, that's not something that a chimp will ever understand and ever follow.
But do different groups have different games that they play? Like, can you describe a different culture for different groups?
Well, the apes have a tendency the young ones have a tendency to invent new games all the time. And so they may have a game of digging a hole and putting water in it and then stirring it. And that's their game for the coming 2 weeks. And then somebody else invents another game. And so like children, they have these phases that they go through with different games. But most of those are not competitive. It's not like one team against another team. It's just a game that they play together. It's more togetherness than competition. No, and they play a lot of games, but the rule-based games, that is a very human thing,
You mentioned empathy, and I think this is something that I would love to focus on a little bit more. Looking at the evolution of human spaces, especially in terms of public life among humans, do you see that we have more empathy toward each other or less empathy as we go on and the evolution moves on?
I think the basic forms of empathy in humans and other mammals are very similar. Humans have a more complex form of empathy, maybe. So the basic form of empathy is that I'm affected by the emotions that you show. You are distressed, it makes me distressed. You are happy and laughing, I will be laughing with you. That's a very basic emotional connection. It's called emotional empathy. And I think that is what we find in all the mammals. There's now rodent studies on it, dog studies, also all sorts of mammals have that basic emotional contagion. The more complex forms is where I try to understand your situation. I try to understand your life and imagine myself in your position, for example, or walk in your shoes. That is much more complex. We have indications that apes can do this. I personally think that also dolphins and elephants can do this to some degree. But that's a more complex form of empathy. And then the most complex forms, I think they may be uniquely human, is where we can even empathize with somebody who we don't see. We read about a person in a novel, and we empathize with this person in the novel, which is a completely abstract sort of situation. And I don't think that kind of empathy occurs in other species. So there's many levels, and the very complex cognitive levels are maybe uniquely human. But let's take a very simple expression of empathy in chimps. If one chimp loses a fight and screams and sits in the corner, others will come over and groom and kiss and try to reassure them. And that's a very typical act of empathy in the chimpanzee. Dogs do the same thing with humans. There's now experiments also on that, is that if a person cries in the family, the dog will come over and put their head in their lap and they have also a tendency to console. So these very basic forms of empathy are general, but there are forms, I think, that are too complex and that are found only in our species.
I think that what we see in history is the capacity of humans to take this basic ability and then stretch it in all kinds of directions for either good or bad. You can use cultural means, again, like storytelling and mythology, to create empathy towards people you never met. And you just read about them and you still have very strong empathy towards them. And this is the basis for nationalism. You know, there is a lot of argument about nationalism. As a historian, I think that if you understand nationalism correctly, it is one of the best inventions of humankind ever, because at the basis of nationalism is not hatred of foreigners. Hating foreigners and minorities, this is not nationalism. Nationalism is about loving your compatriots and caring for them. And the amazing thing is that we are able to care for millions of strangers we never met. And, you know, I pay my taxes so that somebody on the other side of the country that I never met will get good healthcare or good education. I empathize with this person, which I've never met him or her. Mm-hmm. And this is really amazing and wonderful. The other side of the coin, of course, that you can use the same mechanisms of inventing all kinds of stories and spreading them to cause hatred and cruelty towards people you never met, or towards people that you don't know anything about them except for their skin color or except for their religious belief or their sexual orientation, and you will immediately feel very negative emotions towards them just because of some story you believe. I think I've read in your new book that one of the things that really caught my attention is that among apes, for example, there is no discrimination against an ape just because of their fur color or because of their sexual preferences.
Yeah. Yeah, that's both true. Is that there are primates like a certain kind of spider monkey that has many color variations from very dark to almost white. And people have never found that they discriminate on the basis of color. So that would not be typical, and sexual orientation for sure. No, I don't think they think in terms of categories in that regard. They think more in terms of individuals. This individual is like this, that individual is like that. And there's no intolerance there. But do you think, because you say nationalism has little to do with disparaging other groups, do you think nationalism could exist in humans if there were not some outside groups? I look at it as an in-group, out-group phenomenon, which we find in many animals. In humans, of course, it's on a much larger scale. The group is not just 100 individuals, it's like a million of multiple millions. And so there's anonymity in that area. But do you think humans could be nationalistic if there were not outside groups? Because I think those two things are linked.
Yeah, I think you need outside groups to have nationalism, but then at the basis, you don't need to have hatred and violence and war. You can have more positive attitudes as the basis. And it can manifest itself in things like, again, the Olympics, that you need the other teams in order to feel great loyalty towards your own team.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the main thing you do is go around beating the fans of the other team or starting wars. No, I mean, you need several teams, but you can have consensus about the basic rules and how to organize everything. And the main expression of your nationalism is loving your team, not hating the others. And this manifests also, I think, in politics, that the good type of nationalism, you look around the world today, you see leaders who claim they are great patriots. Why? Because they hate the foreigners or the minorities. But the same leaders don't pay their taxes. And for me, it's completely wrong. I mean, you want to prove your patriotism, pay your taxes honestly. This is far more important than hating some foreign group. Or you want to prove your patriotism, don't, when you come to appoint officials, appoint the most qualified persons and not your cousin or your friend. This is proof that you're putting the nation first. Hating minority groups, this is no proof at all. So I think in history, we have these different models of nationalism. And I think there is a tendency in some scholarly circles to have a knee-jerk hostility towards nationalism as if it's all bad and it causes nothing but wars and so forth. But we need a more balanced view that nationalism, yes, historically it often led to terrible things because people understood it mainly as about hatred. But we should cultivate a more positive understanding of nationalism as caring about your fellow citizens, that it manifests itself in paying taxes and creating a national healthcare system, not in fighting wars. And this understanding, I think, would be much more helpful than kind of tarnishing the whole national project as something negative that we should somehow eliminate, because it's not going to happen. I mean, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, because humans are very quick in making in-group, out-group distinctions. There are these early experiments by a Dutch psychologist, Jaap Rabbi was his name. After World War II, he wanted to understand how groups could have hated each other so much. And he set up these experiments in the Netherlands where he would bring in groups into a room, a group of people randomly. He would randomly assign them a blue pen. Some of them would get a blue pen. The other ones would get a green pen. And then he would start talking about them like the blue penned people and the green penned people. And very soon, he would have them give a little speech, and then you would have to rate the speech. Very soon, the green penned people felt that the green pen speeches were much better than the blue, and the other way around. And so within randomly assigned people, he immediately created groups.
But the thing is that if you look at the experiment, you see that it didn't come out naturally. It was the result of manipulation from above. This is divide and rule. If you have a leader that deliberately creates division in society, you have the green people and the blue people, then yes, you have this kind of thing. But this is the responsibility of leaders. They can create division and hatred, but it's not inevitable.
But it shows how easy it is in the human species to create that. And often the groups that we dislike are the groups that are most similar to us. So, for example, I remember the DNA studies that show that the Japanese and the Koreans are DNA-wise very close, but they don't like each other. I think with the Jews and the Palestinians in Israel, it's probably very similar. DNA-wise, they're very close, but they don't like each other. And so I think the groups that are close to each other are the ones who often dislike each other the most, because they interact more, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think Freud called it, what was it? The kind of, I forgot the expression, but you need to, it's harder to separate yourself from somebody who is very close to you, so you need to work harder. And again, you look at religious divides. So if you look back at the history of Europe or even the Netherlands, at the way that Catholics and Protestants
I know all about it. Yeah, I know all about that.
You know, about what? About different interpretations of the religion of love. They go around telling everybody that love is the main principle of our religion, but because the other person understands the religion of love a little bit differently than me, then I'll kill him in the name of the religion of love.
Some of that is completely artificial, but in chimpanzees, for example, we've had cases. Well, it's not based on ideology or religion for sure, but in one group of chimpanzees that was studied by Jane Goodall, the individuals lived together. They did everything together. At some point, the group split in two, and so one group went to this territory, the other one went to that territory, and within a couple of years, they started killing each other. So that's very amazing to us as primatologists, as these are individuals who played together, they know each other very well, but now they hate each other. And so you can create hatred also in humans between individuals who normally could get along. And sometimes these things happen, I suppose under Tito in Yugoslavia, everyone got along, but as soon as this man disappeared, everyone was not getting along anymore. And so in humans, you have these artificial situations that can either bring people together or drive them apart. And the politicians know very well how to do that. They do that all the time.
So is the hatred unique to humans? Do animals know how to hate each other?
Oh yeah, of course. They know how to love each other and how to hate each other. And so the in-group, out-group distinction is very, very serious for them, and goes together with a lot of aggression and sometimes killing in some species. In most species.
Is it hate? Because I understand how I do understand how animals can fight over territory, for example.
Yeah.
That's obvious. That's easy to understand.
Yeah.
But like pure hatred, because you just mentioned that animals don't hate each other because of a different color of fur, for example. And as we know very well, people do know how to hate each other because of the color of the skin.
Yeah.
So is it unique to humans, this kind of hate?
Yeah, I don't think hate is unique to humans. I think love and hate are things that you find in other species, but hating based on an artificial usually small distinction, I think that's typically human. And so, as Yuval said, for example, the Protestants and the Catholics, it's amazing because they basically have the same religion. In my opinion, it's not terribly different. But within the Protestants, I live now in the US, where you have all these Protestant denominations that hate each other, even though they're even harder to tell apart, I would say. But yeah, people hate on small differences. Now, and that I think that's typically human to carve up things. We do that with races, we do it with ideologies, we do it with sexuality. We label things and we carve it up, and then we start hating each other for this or for that. And I don't know why we do that, but it's a terrible affliction of our species.
In a way, you can say that in animals, sometimes objective conditions kind of force them into competition and violence. Like there is a limited amount of food, and if the other group gets it, then we don't. Yeah. And sometimes people imagine that humans fight for the same reason, that there is a limited amount of territory and food, so we have to fight. But actually, again, as a historian, my impression is that the vast majority of wars in history were not about objective resources. They were about all these invented stories that define our identity. And the wars are really about the stories, not about the territory, not about the food. If you look at the history of Europe, a century ago, Europeans were killing each other by the millions, even though at the time they controlled most of the world. And still they had all this territory and resources, still couldn't agree. Yeah. Now, Europe doesn't have these enormous empires. Actually, they have a much smaller territory, and yet they lived in amazing peace, at least when looked from the Middle East. It's amazing, the peace of Europe, not because they have more territory to divide, but because they found a story that they all can agree on. And when I look at Israelis and Palestinians, it's the same. If you look at the territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, it's one of the, I would say yes, it's one of the most crowded places on earth. That's true. But still, objectively, there is enough space to build houses and schools and hospitals for everybody. There is enough food. People fight because they can't find a single story that they can all agree on of who we are and how should we live.
Yeah, but I think in Europe, yeah, there is maybe a narrative there, but there's also an important economic incentive now. After World War II, the Europeans, especially Italy, France, the Benelux, Germany, decided that it would be better to create mutual dependencies, economic dependencies, and that would foster peace. That was the idea of the European Union. And at that time, the Brits were still on board. They now have decided that they don't need to be part of it. But to create an economic unity would prevent war. And I think it has worked. And by the way, in the primates, we have the same thing. I've done a lot of research on conflict resolution. And the main idea in that field is what we call the valuable relationship hypothesis, which is that if you need each other, if there's value to your relationship, you will try to get along and you will make peace after fights. If there's no shared value to your relationship, you don't get much out of it, then you can have these endless wars as we used to have in Europe. And so the European Union was based on the ideas that you increase the value of the relationships, economic value, and that will create peace. And I think it has worked marvelously in the European Union. And what you say about getting along without resource competition, that is, of course, something that many political leaders try to do when they try to divide people. They try to tell them that these immigrants that are coming are going to take your jobs. You know, these immigrants, even though I can see here in the US with the immigrants from the South, from Mexico and so on, they do a lot of jobs that Americans don't want to do. So they're not taking anybody's jobs, but that's the storyline that we are being told. We are being told that we will lose because they're coming in. And that's what politicians do all the time, everywhere, I think. And it's really a manipulation of the storyline, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that we have within us these tendencies we've inherited from our evolutionary past that can be easily manipulated. It's much easier to win an election by scaring people about immigrants than by scaring people about climate change. Why? Not because immigrants are inherently more dangerous to our survival than climate change, but because we are kind of evolutionarily programmed to fear the other group, the chimpanzees beyond the hill, much more than to think about the impact of what we do on the atmosphere and the climate and so forth. Because until very recently, there was no way that we could really impact the climate or that we could do anything about it. So we are not emotionally, we are not prepared to the kind of power that we have. And that's a basic problem in today's politics.
Yeah. And also the problem is that even though we humans, we can think ahead and we can think ahead better than almost any other species, we don't use that capacity very often. So we can think ahead 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. We know what's coming. And the scientists tell us what is coming in terms of climate change. But the politicians and most people, I think, they think short term. They think in 5 years terms, or that's all they do.
So the other conclusion that you're trying to make, as far as I understand, is that this is all the blame of the politicians. So if not for the politicians, the world would be a better place to live, which, being a journalist, I totally agree on. I think this is the absolute truth. But you also mentioned the values that we are building as humans that makes it easier for us to live together. And with all of the evolution and all of the scientific progress, the technology, the amazing technology that we're witnessing right now, do you think that it's easier for us to create the values that make it easier for us to live together, or does it make it more difficult for us to create the values?
No, but potentially it makes it easier. We do see today more global cooperation and tolerance than in any previous time in history. Again, if you take the example of the Olympics, you could not have an Olympics 1,000 years ago. You could never reach some kind of global agreement on something like that. And also, I'm not against politicians as a group. I think some politicians are wonderful. It's not inherent in the profession that they should all be evil or corrupt or whatever. It's a profession like any other. I don't think I could do their job for them. I'm totally against giving, for example, scientists political authority. I don't think it's a good idea. Politics is a vocation in its own right. You need to train for it. You need specific skills. You need to be able to represent people. I don't represent people. Nobody voted for me. So I'm totally against, like pushing the politicians aside and letting scientists decide everything. Politicians should consult with scientists, but ultimately, the political decisions should be made by the representatives of people, not by some professional experts. But politicians, again, I'm in favor of responsible politicians. Too often today, you get this kind of authentic politician, a person who says the first thing that comes to their mind and thinks that this makes them authentic. And I don't want authenticity from politicians. I want responsibility. I look at my own mind, I see all the nonsense and all the terrible things that sometimes pop up in my mind. I don't say them, at least I try not to. There should be some kind of barrier between the mind and the mouth. And I expect even more from politicians that don't tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Like, your words are like seeds that go into the mind of millions of people. If you say words of hatred, you are planting seeds of hatred in the minds of millions of people. They will result in a forest of violence and hatred. So be very responsible and careful. And there are politicians like that. It's not impossible.
Yeah, so when we complain about politicians, we're in a way complaining about the human response to politicians. Because the politicians manipulate us, and they can manipulate us because we fall for the nonsense that they tell us. And so the politicians are not entirely to blame for what their followers do with them. And as far as leadership is concerned, well, I agree completely that we don't need to hand it over to the scientists. I don't trust science with this necessarily, with taking moral decisions or political decisions. I've studied alpha males in many species, and alpha males come in sort of two varieties. In chimpanzees, for example, you have the bullies who do the sort of thing that Yuval is talking about, the bullies who manipulate and try to dominate everyone and terrorize everybody and insist on loyalty and all of that kind of things. But you also have leaders who are real leaders in the sense that they keep the peace, they come up for the underdog, they lead the group, and so they exist too. And so you have sort of a variety of leaders, and it's up to the group to decide who will be in power. In a way, it's a democratic process. So, for example, in chimpanzees, the smallest male can be the alpha male. It doesn't need to be the biggest and the strongest male. But that small male will need support from the group. Otherwise, he cannot keep that position. So the group needs to put their weight behind him. And if he's a good leader, they will keep him there. And if he's not a good leader, they will wait for an opportunity to have a challenger get rid of him. And so in a way, you have that same sort of variety of leadership. At the moment in human society, very interestingly, we have more and more female leaders. And I don't know if you've noticed, but with the COVID crisis, the female leaders have generally reacted a little bit differently than the male leaders. So at least we have had some male leaders, like here in the US and in Brazil and other places, who have tried to manipulate the system. Instead of fighting the virus, they made the virus the enemy, so to speak, or their political enemy, and they didn't listen to the scientists. And they have tried to manipulate things based on what happened with the virus. But we have now increasingly female leaders, and they have, on average, I would think, done better than the male leaders in handling the corona crisis. So at the moment we have these this variety. You have good male leaders, bad male leaders. You have female leaders, probably also good and bad ones, and so we have a greater variety of them.
Do you see evolutional change in the role of the gender in human species? Because you mentioned the female politicians who deal differently with the coronavirus situation. There are a lot of people who say that there's a bigger change coming in a way that in the role that gender plays in human life. Do you see it coming?
Yeah, I think the human gender roles are fairly flexible, in my opinion. There are certain biological constraints, like women can make babies and women need to nurse babies. And so there are certain biological constraints, but not in what I would say leadership necessarily. I don't think males are better leaders, and I don't think humans need to fixate on that. And if I look at our closest relatives, we have chimpanzees and bonobos as our two closest primate relatives, and the bonobos are female-dominated species and the chimpanzees are a male-dominated species. And so they don't tell us a very consistent story on what we need to do in our society. And I think in both species we have female leaders, and in both species we have male leaders. So even in the chimpanzee, which we call male-dominated, because the males are really dominant there, you have female leaders. I have written a book about a female chimpanzee mama who was a really central figure in a chimpanzee community. And so physical dominance and leadership are not the same thing for me. And so you can have a society like the chimpanzee society where the males are physically dominant. That doesn't mean that they decide everything that's going on there. So I do have a more flexible view of this. And I don't think there's any biological reason why you would say that males need to be the leaders of human society. That would be nonsense, in my opinion.
Mr. Harari, do you see the change coming in the history of humanity?
Yeah, the patriarchal societies dominated by males have been the norm among humans for thousands of years. And if we had this conversation a century ago, 2 centuries ago, it would have been easy to imagine that this is just dictated by biology. Because you look throughout the world, throughout history, in the Middle East, in Europe, in America, and at least if you look at large-scale societies, not at hunter-gatherer bands, but at kingdoms and empires and so forth, they are all patriarchal. So you would think this is a fixture, maybe dictated by biology. But then the last 100 years have seen maybe the biggest revolution, social revolution in human history, the change in gender relations and gender roles. And the amazing thing from my perspective about this revolution is not only how swift it was and how big it was, but also how peaceful it was. For people who think about revolution, something like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, then they think that in order to have a big change in society, you need a lot of violence, you need guillotines, you need gulags, you need to wage wars. Otherwise, how can you make change? You know, all these communist slogans that to make an omelette, you need to break a few eggs. Or if you want to chop wood, there are splinters. But you look at the revolution in gender relations, and it's a completely different story. As far as I know, feminists never started any wars, never assassinated any presidents, did not send people to the gulag, and they managed to change maybe the most fundamental aspects of human society very quickly. And I think that in the 21st century, the pace of change will be even faster. And I mean, when I look today at the academic world, I see something that as a historian makes me a bit ashamed. I see tyrants and autocratic rulers like Putin in Russia, like Orban in Hungary, that they are closing down departments of gender studies. And they are trying to wage war against gender studies. And they leave the history department and the philosophy department alone. And this tells me that we don't endanger them. But the gender studies department, this is where the really important stuff is happening. Because these are the departments that they are trying to close. And I think that if you want to understand not just gender relations, but the more broad revolution that will happen in human relations and in the very meaning of humanity in the coming decades, the place to go is the gender studies department.
Mm-hmm. And you know, some of that started with biology. So the pill, is the only pill that we call the pill. The pill is a small biological invention that changed a lot of things because it gave us control over reproduction, and it allowed sort of decoupling of sex and reproduction. Because, of course, to have smaller families, we could also have stopped having sex, but for the human species, that is not really a good option. And so the pill was necessary, but it's a small biological invention that greatly contributed to this particular revolution by reducing the family size. And I think you're right. I think the gender relations, first of all, they have some basis in biology, but we shouldn't exaggerate that basis. I think there's quite a bit of flexibility there. And second, it is on the move. It's clearly on the move. Another major difference that I see is that in the old days, if I had been born 50 years before when I was born, I would probably have ended up in the army or something. And many young men in Europe during World War I and World War II were killed on the battlefields. And so in the old days, the privileges of man were only for the rich man, I think. Poor men, poor boys, they ended up in the army and they ended up being killed. And that stopped. When that stopped in Europe, all this warfare that we had going on, it exposed more the privileges of maleness than before. So before that time, you could argue, well, all these boys, they end up in the army. And so being a boy was not really a privilege, in my opinion, in that time. But after the peace settled in Europe, it became more obvious that men have a good life compared to women, and that women have to fight for a lot of basic things like voting rights, education, birth control. Women had to fight for a lot of things that were not available to them. And I think it became more clear how the gender relations were out of whack at that time. And I think those two things have greatly contributed. The invention of the pill and the ending of the wars and the killing that was associated with that.
Yeah, and when we think about the invention of the pill, as you say, it's such a small technological invention with such a huge social and cultural impact. So now we are developing far more remarkable technology to start changing the human body, the human brain. And again, I think you look at the debates today about transgenders, And I try to understand why are so many people so upset or excited or whatever about this relatively very small part of humanity. And I think that deep down we understand that this is kind of the vanguard of the future. That if you want to think about one field in which new technologies are really changing in a fundamental way what it means to be human or our identity, then transgenders is kind of the obvious place to go. And this is kind of the template for transhumanism in many ways. That it starts maybe with gender, but it will increasingly impact more and more parts of human identity.
You mentioned the pill, and I think for me the pill is about the freedom of a woman to choose. And before I let you go, in the last few minutes, I would like to ask you a more general question about freedom. With all the evolution going on, with all the history of humanity going on, do you think we get more freedom? And we talk a lot about freedom. Politicians talk about freedom, but all of us talk about freedom all the time. Do you see more that this is the key issue for us? And do you see a humanity getting more freedom to choose to live the way that we want to live, to explore and do everything else? Or do you see us doing everything we do and limiting the freedom that we have?
I think we have a choice, again, between extremes. The technological and political developments are kind of constantly increasing the stakes. We have the potential for greater freedom than ever before, including especially freedom from disease, freedom from hunger, freedom from oppression. We can create a more free world than ever before. But at the same time, the same technology also creates the potential for the worst totalitarian regimes in human history. If you think about the new surveillance technology, so, in the old communist bloc, there could be a secret police agent following you 24 hours a day, but they didn't really have the capacity to follow everybody all the time, and they didn't have the ability to analyze all the information. Like you would have these mountains of paper in the secret police headquarters, and nobody had the ability to read all that and analyze it. And of course, they never had the ability to go inside your body, to actually monitor what you feel and think. So if there is a speech by the great leader on television or on radio, everybody has to listen, and you can smile and clap your hands, and nobody knows that you actually hate the guy. But in 10 years, with the present technology, you can create something far worse than the Soviet Union or Poland under communism.
Yeah, it is already happening.
Yeah, you don't need human agents to follow you around. Use technology to follow everybody. You can, for the first time in history, you can follow everybody 24 hours a day. You can analyze all that information, and you can go under the skin. You can increasingly also monitor what people actually feel and think. And we have to be very careful about it. So we have this choice. If we make the wrong decisions in the next 10 years, we will end up with a totalitarian regime worse than the Soviet Union in the days of Stalin. If we make wise decisions, we will end with a better and more free society than ever before.
Yeah. Since we all walk around with iPhones nowadays, smartphones, that has become a device to check on everybody. We know where everybody is, but we may even know what they are saying, with whom they are talking. It's just incredible, the potential for monitoring that occurs. And for me, the word freedom is always sort of a bit triggering, because I think freedom is overrated. Makes me think of Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, who says, the pursuit of happiness, the Americans had that freedom and the pursuit of happiness, and de Gaulle said happiness is for idiots. And I think in a way that's maybe true. I think freedom is overrated, because people, for example, who have children, are they free? No, they have children at home. They need to take care of them. So how free are they to do whatever they want to do? And so I think we should be careful with the term freedom. And as you say, we live in a time where it's getting scary now. It's getting scary the way the Chinese, for example, are monitoring everybody in their country. And so we get now these systems being set up that may suppress an enormous amount of human activity because Big Brother is watching us all the time now.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just add that, when you think about freedom, some people think that, again, it's an innate human right or innate human ability. We have free will or whatever. I think freedom is not something we have. Mm-hmm. Freedom is something we have to struggle for. Mm-hmm. That it's, you need to struggle for it. You can never take it for granted that you just have it because you're a human being.
Yeah, but we all have obligations and commitments. Yeah. And so freedom, it's wonderful to be free to some degree, but I think it's overrated. Yeah.
I think that if you understand freedom as just, I'll do whatever I want at any minute, that's not real freedom. Real freedom includes the ability to commit to something long-term. It can be to commit to another person, a husband, a wife, to commit to children, to commit to some, I want to write a book. So the freedom to write a book involves spending, 3 years researching and writing and editing it. If it's just a momentary impulse, I do it now, in 5 minutes I'll stop, I will never be able to write the book. So freedom, real freedom, very often includes a large measure of committing yourself long-term to some individual, to some group, to some project.
Yes, so it's a bit like with animals in the wild, like let's say chimpanzees in the forest. People say, oh, they're free. They have to work every day to get their fruits. They have to be careful because they're leopards and they have their enemy chimpanzees that they need to deal with. They are free compared to, let's say, a captive chimpanzees in captivity who get their food brought to them by humans. I think freedom is a difficult concept, but it's thrown around very easily, and it's equated with happiness, which to me is not the same thing. I think you can be perfectly happy in an unfree situation.
My freedom to postpone the end of this discussion is definitely over. So we have to finish this. Thank you so much for finding time. I do hope to see you in Poland in person.
I hope so. Yeah.
This is the second time I meet Mr. Harari, and we still never met. So please come to Poland next year.
I really want to. My family is originally from Poland, so I really want to come and see kind of my ancestral home. But until the COVID crisis is over, I'll probably have to wait.
Yeah. Mr. Harari, Mr. De Waal, thank you so much for finding time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice seeing you. Bye-bye.
Szanowni Państwo, tak właśnie dobiegł końca pierwszy dzień Igrzysk Wolności, ale zanim rozejdziemy się, mam dla Państwa wiadomość. Dla tych, którzy troskali się o los profesora Fergusona, udało nam się nawiązać z nim kontakt i już jutro zapraszam Państwa na spotkanie, na rozmowę z nim w tej sali o godzinie 15:15. Zanim powiemy sobie dobranoc, chciałabym Państwu w imieniu organizatorów, wszystkich naszych prelegentów, prelegentek, ekspertów i ekspertek podziękować serdecznie za uwagę i zaprosić na jutrzejszy dzień. Dobranoc mówią Państwu Fundacja Liberté i Olga Brzezińska.